Hello, welcome to our Exploring Sustainable Substrates webinar. This is brought to you by Pitmoss and Next Cycle Michigan. My name is Maggie Cullinan. I am the current manager of research and development at Pitmoss. I want to say first and foremost, I am not a grower. I just have the good fortune of working with an extremely knowledgeable and wise grower at Pitmoss, Dr. Bethke. But I am a sustainability professional, I am a soil scientist, and I am passionate about all forms of sustainability and stewardship. And just a little bit about Pitmoss and Next Cycle. So Pitmoss is a manufacturer of high quality potting media and animal bedding. We do that entirely in the USA, made out of recycled materials. And Next Cycle Michigan supports development of sustainable businesses in Michigan. And we are coming together to help the horticulture and agriculture industries become more aware of sustainability issues facing them, and what we can do as an industry to look towards the future and improve. So what we'll cover today, we'll go over a brief history of substrates and where the industry is headed, the meaning of sustainability, thinking about the environment and beyond, understanding resilience, how exploring sustainable substrates can benefit your business now and in the long term. And then the real meat of this webinar will actually be hearing from our panelists who are on the call right now. They are real growers with real experience, and they will tell you all about what they know on this topic. So to get started, just a brief history of substrates. The substrate industry has changed over time as the demands of horticulture and agriculture have changed. So Dr. Bethke actually came up with this 3-paradigm framework to describe the changes that the industry has seen. So the first paradigm is native soil sterilization. The second paradigm involves peat and other non-renewable resources. And the third paradigm is upcycled and local materials. So native soil sterilization began long before what we're doing right now. In the beginning, containerized media was just soil that people dug out of the ground and put it in pots. On the left is actually a recreation or an artist's idea of what the Hanging Gardens of Babylon might have looked like. This is just to show, this is one of our first recorded instances of potted plant growth outside of the ground. So in the past, people gathered soil from outside and put it into pots to cultivate their plants indoors or just anywhere not in the ground. The problem with this is that native soil does not like to be disturbed. It is heavy because of its mostly mineral composition. The aeration can be a problem because when you disturb that native mineral soil, it loses its structure. So water and gas exchange can be an issue in a container. It required sterilization, which was an extremely energy-intensive process. Energy meaning people, labor had to lift this soil and sterilize it and do a lot of work to get it usable in containers, so no diseases were brought from outside to inside, and it was inconsistent. You had to know where to get the soil that had the desirable texture or properties. Otherwise, you would have an inconsistent product in your pots. And this continued well into the 20th century until horticulturists went in search of lighter, more consistent soil alternatives. So in the UK in the 1930s, the John Innes composts were developed. And the basic mix for this was loam, peat, sand, and fertilizer. And you'll notice that loam and sand are still both mineral components of soil. It was still a heavy mix, but it was lighter, and it was still inconsistent, but it was better. And then in the 1960s, Cornell developed the Cornell peat light mix. This included peat, vermiculite, perlite, bark, fertilizers, and wetting agents. And you will notice at this point, there is no more mineral soil in this mix. Vermiculite and perlite are both just the rocks that we mine and then manipulate to have certain properties. And this mix was kind of revolutionary in that it was light while still meeting bulk density requirements. It was sterile, so it completely avoided that time-consuming, labor-intensive process of soil sterilization, and it drained well while still being able to retain water thanks to the peat. And this was really the advent of soilless growing media as we know it today. These soilless mixes required the use of imported or extracted materials. So peat, you might not know this, comes from drained and mined bogs in the subarctic. This plant matter grown in bogs basically decays, sinks below the surface of a very wet, cold bog, or it dies and then sinks below the surface of a very wet, cold bog and then does not decay. And so we're basically left with this plant skeleton that has this remarkable natural ability to retain water on its surface. Vermiculite and perlite are both mined from quarries. They are expanded rock, so we mine them, heat them to extreme temperatures, and they puff up and give us these really special porous properties. And sand, which is still used in a lot of containers, is dug up from rivers, it's removed from coastlines and mines, and we are actually facing a sand shortage at the moment. It's becoming an issue. So the problem with these resources is that they can't really last forever. And this ties into the idea, this perspective that we could use these materials ties into the idea of living better through chemistry. So this was also at the time when we were applying more pesticides, using more fertilizers, and we didn't really fully understand the consequences that that would have on our natural environment, and in turn, what that would do to our own systems in the long term. So we're still largely in this second paradigm. A lot of growers are still peat-based. We use a lot of those extracted materials still. And I don't want to discount the progress of this paradigm because it was critical to the development of the horticulture industry as it exists today. But now we're learning more about the consequences of this style of substrate. And you can see on the right, I've got two separate supply chains. I've got cardboard to trash and peat to plants. But in the future, we're looking to taking those waste materials, engineering them, and turning them into usable, sustainable substrates. So that is what the third paradigm is about. It's about using upcycled and local materials to create viable potting soils. So I work for Pitmoss. We use recycled paper and cardboard to make substrates, but there are other resources available today, like wood fiber, which comes from, trees, biochar, which can come from waste products, composts. All of these things can be used to replace some of those traditional materials. And there are tons and tons of other ones. I mean, rice hulls, hemp, all of these things, there's a varied amount of them, and we're still learning how to use those materials. But sustainability has to come to the horticultural industry. But why is that? Well, if you want an industry to be sustainable, it means you want it to be able to continue. A lot of people hear sustainability and think environmentally friendly, but that's not necessarily the case. Sustainability is often visualized as a three-legged stool. So we have the environmental leg, the social leg, and the economic leg. Social sustainability means that something is fair and just. It supports people and culture. Environmental sustainability means it benefits or does not degrade our natural environment. And economic sustainability means that that system generates or does not hinder the generation of financial wealth. So when you picture this stool, you have to imagine that your system is sitting on top of it. And the reason that this idea is so important is because if one leg of that stool collapses, the entire system collapses. It doesn't have to happen fast. It doesn't have to happen suddenly. It's not like catastrophic failure. It just means that if all of these things are not aligned, then that system cannot continue to persist in the way that it is currently existing indefinitely. Something has to give. And it's also important to remember that one broken leg can result in damage to the others. So some illustrative examples: what happens when business-focused cost-cutting measures, so an attempt to make a business more economically sustainable, result in decreased employee safety? Well, now you have a social sustainability problem. People aren't going to want to stay and work there. It's too dangerous. So that business cannot persist. What happens when environmental problems affect the supply chain? That's kind of what's happening right now in our industry with peat. So environmental issues, regulations, that sort of thing are impacting the economics of peat. And you saw this graphic in some of our communications about this webinar. This is from the USGS Mineral Commodity Summaries from 2003 to 2023. This is just the reporting of what exactly was happening with the peat price over those years. And you can see in recent years, it's really started to fluctuate. This is because of unpredictable storms, issues with the harvesting of the peat, all kinds of problems. But on our side of things, in the horticultural industry, this is leading to unpredictability in price and supply, and that is not good for business. That makes it really hard for growers to predict what next year will be like, what their margins need to be like in order for them to sustain themselves. So sustainability is not just about protecting the environment, it's about protecting your business in the long term. And that means taking all three of those considerations, the environment, the economy, and also the social conditions of a thing into consideration. And this ties into the idea of resilience. So a lot of times in sustainability circles, sustainability and resilience will be kind of paired together. Resilience is the capacity to withstand or recover quickly from difficulties. So in this example, I know these are not apples to apples comparisons, but these are just illustrative examples. The banana is a clone. All bananas are clones, which means they're all susceptible to the same disease. So if you're a banana farmer and your plantation gets a disease, well, now you're out all of your money, you're out your whole crop. It's a major problem. How do you recover from that? In contrast, a diversified farm grows lots and lots of different crops. So if one of them fails, they still have plenty of opportunities to make the money that they need to make to sustain themselves. So that farm is resilient to change. So diversification can be a good way to embed resilience within your business. To that end, exploring sustainable substrate options can give you a plan B if unforeseen challenges with your current substrate arise. And that brings me to this idea that there doesn't have to be anything wrong with your current substrate for you to want to explore new options or different combinations of ingredients, because it's better to prepare for those challenging situations before they occur. If there's a shortage with one of your materials, peat, core, whatever, if you have a backup plan that you know you can manage, you know you can implement and be successful with, then your business is more resilient to changes beyond your control. So understanding multiple substrate options and management requirements can make you prepared for weaknesses or changes in substrate supply chains. Now, the big question here is also what makes a substrate sustainable? A few general rules of thumb when it comes to sustainability: the farther it has to travel to reach you, the less environmentally sustainable it likely is. So coconut coir is something that is often touted as a peat moss alternative, but there's kind of more environmental consequences with that too, because it has to travel from India and Sri Lanka to get to the United States. So that's a lot of carbon emissions. That's not so environmentally sustainable. The more processing it requires, the less sustainable it's likely to be. So if something has to be engineered or manufactured in a really energy intensive process with lots and lots of processing, that can be less sustainable. Virgin materials will frequently be less sustainable than byproducts or recycled alternatives. So in the case, let's say we'll use pit moss as an example. Cardboard is already being produced as part of a different process. We can take that waste and use it to make a really high quality substrate. Virgin materials, on the other hand, if we had to go out and extract a material to make our substrates, that would be less sustainable because we're no longer using a waste product. A few other notes: there's more to consider than just the sustainability of the substrate itself. So some substrates can contribute to the sustainability of your overall operation, meaning the environmental and economic sustainability of your operation by using less water and less fertilizer. So these are also considerations that you want to think about as you explore different options. Poor labor practices are a threat to the sustainability of a product. So if something is being made using unfair labor practices, it's going to eventually impact the availability of that product or can be a problem going forward. And also, laws and regulations can influence product availability and therefore the sustainability of that supply chain. So if certain substrates are coming under fire, by regulators, then you just want to have your thumb on that because it might impact your availability to source that material. So here are some reasons that you might want to explore sustainable substrate options. These are reasons that we have heard from our customers or from people that use other products. First, I want to use a substrate that's produced entirely in the USA. A lot of substrate materials are imported. Maybe this is really important to you, maybe it's not. I want to grow peat-free for environmental reasons. Maybe those bogs are just really close to your heart and you want to stop requiring that they be drained and harvested. I think growing peat-free would help me stand out to customers. Market pressures can be a really good reason to explore other options. People are becoming more aware of what sustainability means in all parts of their lives. So this could be sort of a feather in your cap as a grower when your customers see your products on the shelves. I want to reduce the amount of fertilizer and water that I use. Again, this is a consequence of exploring other substrate options. You want to be more efficient overall. That can impact your bottom line and the environment. Or maybe I want to explore alternatives to make my operation more resilient to supply chain challenges. You're seeing the numbers, you're seeing the supply chain and price fluctuations, and you just want to make sure that you have something in your back pocket that you can use going forward should something happen. So that concludes my part of this. We're going to get to the much more interesting part, which is actually our panel discussion. So I will turn off my screen sharing. And the first thing I would love for our panelists to do is actually give us a brief introduction about you and your businesses. So how long have you been growing? What do you grow? Who are your customers? That sort of thing. So I think I will start with Chris.
Hello, thank you for having me. Yeah, my name is Chris Dennison. I'm the owner of Country Roots. We're based out of Big Rapids area of Michigan. We're a regenerative soil company. So we work with a variety of soil and soil types and soil conditions and a variety of different types of farmers. But my overall goal is to, help the farmer in, any different types of circumstances. So we work everything from fields to beds to plots, pots, rows and things. And I work with, about 100 different, soil amendments, minerals and, different fertilizers and things that we use and substrates. So overall, the goal is for me to help people get more use out of their soils and get that long-term aspect to their soils, especially for, home gardeners and farmers and things like that. So that is my main focus. But we do work with a lot of, potted gardeners as well, potted plant nursery type projects. And we noticed there that there's a variety of different conditions that different plants and trees and things like. So have been enjoying experimenting and getting to learn more about, the different types of demands and needs across the agricultural industry. But working with a substrate like pit moss and everything else has fit right into my system. We do a lot of composting as well. So I'm taking in different types of materials and running different compost projects. And then I run some worm farming projects. And I particularly liked mixing my worm bedding with the different compost material with pit moss to help fluff out that substrate and keep the compost and the worms happy. But that's a brief rundown of my business.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think sort of your input as like a producer almost of these materials is going to be really interesting. So Julie, if you would like to introduce yourself.
All right, thanks so much for having me. I'm Julie Vanderwall, and I own and operate Beaver Food Forest, which is a peat-free, coir-free native plant nursery. We primarily grow beaver food, thus our name, Beaver Food Forest. So willow, cottonwood, aspen, that kind of thing, and a lot of other native plants. So I've been growing plants over the past 30 years, but professionally I've been growing native plants over the past decade. And I've developed 17 different peat-free, coir-free potting media recipes this growing season. And we're also currently experimenting with biochar for in-ground soil amendment at our farm and our nursery stooling beds. So I'm just really excited about all the possibilities for ingredients that can come from North America that don't need to be shipped overseas. And my customers are primarily agencies and nonprofits that do ecological restoration work.
Thank you. I'm really excited to have like the native plant perspective on this. Ray, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Ray Greenstreet. Been in the business since I was probably 13. We're on the East Coast. We're just south of Annapolis, and we grow seasonal flowers, perennials, some nursery stock, and a little bit of foliage. And we've been looking for a sustainable product that we can get consistently. We've used Hammerville peat. I've tried the peanut shells at one point before, and been really happy past, I guess, 16 months with pit moss. And we continue to expand the use of it as we learn how to use this new product.
Excellent. So that's more of you're bringing like the commercial grower sort of perspective to this. And I'm really grateful for that. Dr. B, would you like to introduce yourself? You're muted, Dr. B.
Sorry about that. I probably would have been just as well to keep me muted. I've been killing plants for 67 years since I was 8 years old. And I do that in process of all my research. I enjoy doing and developing substrates. And my history is in a greenhouse, then university, family greenhouse, back to a university of doctorate. Then I was technical director for a peat company, Michigan Peat Company, for a number of years, and then private consultant, and joined the pit moss people about 11 years ago. And my whole goal in life is to create substrates that grow plants better. And being able to do it sustainably is in my roots. I did my first research when I was 8 years old with sawdust on the farm. And I've now gone full circle, and we're doing all kinds of wonderful things. And I have a philosophy that you can grow in anything if you work hard enough, but my job is to make it so that you can have a more or less seamless transition from the way you grow now into the way you will grow using sustainable materials.
Yeah, and Dr. B is like the mastermind behind all of our blends at Pit Moss, and he's produced some really amazing materials. So Mark.
Hi, my name is Mark Voss. I own and operate Voss Organics, which is we call it a sub-acre urban farm on the north side of Madison in Wisconsin. I've been growing since 1994. I started out as a CSA farmer, and I've moved more into being a backyard nursery. And we also grow specialty crops for restaurants, mostly tomatoes and greens. We grow about 25,000 to 30,000 3.5-inch pots per year of certified organic vegetable and herb plants that we sell at farmers markets and local food co-ops. And I've been using some sustainable substrates, experimenting with pit moss for the last 3 years. Wanted to do much of what you spoke about, Maggie, in terms of becoming more resilient and more environmentally sustainable with my seedling mix, which I've been kind of working with since 1994, just manipulating that soil mix to make it more resilient and growing better plants over time.
Thank you so much for being here. I love hearing about like urban farming. That's very close to my heart. So we'll just get right into it. And I actually do want to hear from everyone on this front. So I'll probably just go around again about what convinced you. Mark kind of touched on this already, but what convinced you to start exploring sustainable substrate options? Were there problems with your old mix? Was it something else? What drove you to start pursuing alternatives to those traditional materials? So Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, it was pretty timely when I started exploring, alternative substrates, excuse me, right at 2020, the pandemic there, where all of a sudden I had a major disruption of materials, that I was getting. I was completely cut off from peat moss, for a period of time. And, other materials were hard for me to get. And I ended up meeting up with Dr. Bethke that year, just by chance, I guess. And, that's when I got to learn about pit moss. And Dr. Bethke's helped me, keep my business resilient and, stay on a good cutting edge of building soils and having materials around me. So that's where that has all gone down is, ever since 2020, I've been experimenting and practicing and, very, very curious about a variety of materials and where they come from and how sustainable they are. And, I didn't have these thoughts before. It always seemed to me that, materials were going to be pretty plentiful and people were always happy to sell them. And that sort of is the case, but when your supply chain gets disrupted in different, modes of transportation, things got very tricky in 2020. So, as farmers, gardeners, suppliers, we want to stay resilient and we don't want to have to shut down due to a disruption in the supply chain.
So did you feel a bit like caught on the back foot, like caught on your heels when you couldn't get peat moss anymore? Or were you kind of prepared to tackle that, to find alternatives?
No, I was not prepared at all, to be honest. So I was completely taken back and, quite fearful, to be honest, because I didn't know if I was going to be able to push my business forward even anymore. It was an interesting disruption in the case that no matter who I called or how many people I called, I really couldn't find what I needed. And so I was quite fearful for a bit of time. And like I say, started working with Dr. B and was able to keep my business moving forward. I did have a little bit of a lull, but, we've been able to, maintain and stay consistent, from there. And even now, peat is not easy to get necessarily, there's various reasons of materials around. You guys happen to be, drivable distance from me. So that obviously helps versus, most of the peat comes from Canada even. So, there's a variety of reasons that we can have disruption.
Yeah. And Ray, I'm curious what made you start exploring sustainable substrate options, because you're in that sort of conventional growing space where you've been doing it a certain way for a long time.
It was really COVID again. We got, just trying to get supplies in and getting the peat things in and bringing it. Most of our stuff was coming from Canada at the time, and with the trucking and was a couple of years of a lot of heartache trying to get our supplies in order to grow our product. And I had seen and heard about pit moss, being in the U.S. fairly close to us, and thought we'd give it a try, and that's why we reached out to them.
Yeah. And then Mark, you kind of touched on why you chose to explore sustainable substrates already, but was there like any particular catalyst or triggering event that made you like jump on it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was just reflecting. I don't think that there was a triggering event, but I've been sort of suspicious of peat for a long time and curious what an alternative is. I have to say, I love my mix. I've been using a mix that I got from John Birnbaum at the Organic University in 1994. And I've been tweaking it ever since, but it is a peat-based mix. It does have some local ingredients, including compost, which I think I'll always have compost in my mix. But I was really looking for a substitute for peat or a way to reduce peat in my mix. And I didn't have any problems getting peat during the pandemic. I think it's because I'm small scale. And so I was able to get the peat that I usually the amount of peat that I usually get. I think the prices went up and down. Again, because I'm a small scale grower, it wasn't a big it wasn't a big impediment to my business. But I'm looking for a more environmentally friendly and resilient ingredient list in my mix. And I have been experimenting with pit moss, and I'm sure we'll talk later about sort of what the results of that are, but it has folded in well to my existing mix.
Excellent. And then Julie, I'm curious, as like a native plant grower, I'm assuming your reasons are more ecological, but you know what they say about assuming. So I'd love to hear it from.
Yeah, I had a whole range of reasons, but I am a certified ecological restoration practitioner, and so I restore streams and wetlands as my primary vocation. And I realized that a lot of our peat locally was coming from a peat wetland in the county where I live, a really super special wetland. And we're having issues with water quantity in our area. It's a semi-arid area in Washington State. And these wetlands are super important for holding water back during high flows and keeping that water available for late season flows. And that is affecting salmon and people and basically anything that relies on water, which is all of life. And so I was looking at how we were growing in the county where I live, and most of the horticulture businesses were using peat from this one peat wetland. And I was looking at the irony of pulling apart a wetland so that we can grow plants to restore other wetlands, because that's what's happening with ecological restoration. And the more I looked at it, I was just thinking, you know, like what are we doing? You know, there's got to be a better way. And there are so many other ways that we can do it. And so I'm really excited about putting together different recipes that I can suggest to growers who are growing similar plants. And for me, growing riparian plants, water retention is super important in the containers. And so that's where some of these ingredients like pit moss are important, because I'm able to irrigate at a reasonable level and keep my plants adequately wet throughout the crazy heat waves that we've been having, which have been a lot hotter than in the past. So definitely some really strong ecological reasons for me to pursue sustainable substrates. But I also was a career and technical education teacher at a brand new high school commercial greenhouse during the pandemic. And we ran into supply chain issues, and it was a really big deal. And so I was also looking at it from that point of view.
No, that's excellent. So, I mean, I'm really appreciating this because we're getting both the resiliency arguments and also the sustainability, the environmental sustainability side of things. And I think sometimes when this debate comes up, it can become sort of one-sided. It's like you're either environmental or you're not, or, you know, if you do this, you're bad for the environment and that's like wrong, or everything's fine. Like there's just, it becomes one-dimensional really quickly. And I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge that there are many reasons to explore alternative options far beyond just what's happening to peat bogs. But that is also an entirely legitimate reason all by itself. I mean, that's kind of why I work for Pit Moss. I am a soil morphologist by training. I am really jazzed about histosols and organic soils, so I want them to stay where they are. But that's just me. And you also brought up this like water use difference in like different substrates. So I'm gonna start with you again, Julie. Just kind of tell me what substrate alternative you've explored, and then also did anything surprise you about working with alternatives, certain ones, or other sustainable options in general? What have you found?
So I started off working with a lot of different wood products, different shredded forest products, bark, you know, those types of components of potting media. I tried to use them as the primary component in my mixes. And then I added pelletized sheep wool and compost that's made locally with organic straw and sheep manure that's well aged. But I still wasn't quite hitting my target of what I needed for the riparian plants that I was growing in containers. And so I started looking for something to reduce the leaching of nutrients that was happening from my containers, because I had really good nutrients to start with, and then they would all leach out. And so I was looking for paper pellets, because I had read a study where those have been put in the bottom of containers and had significantly reduced the leaching out of nutrients. And I wasn't able to find anybody selling these paper pellets. I don't know. I came across pit moss though, and I thought, well, I could line the bottom of my containers with that. So I reached out, and then I realized that I could do a lot more by mixing it in with my potting media as well as lining the bottom. And then since then, I've also added biochar and some other smaller ingredients, components that help to support the microbes and microorganisms in the mix, because I'm starting with a sterile mix and yet I'm wanting to develop that component as well, that biotic component. So yeah, those are some of the ingredients that I've been working with. And was there a second part to your question?
Just like, did anything surprise you about working with certain materials or unexpected results or that sort of thing?
Yeah, so some of my recipes I kept the same, but then I just would change one ingredient to try to see how that affected the results. And it was really interesting for me to look at some nutrient deficiencies that came out in my plants and to look at recipes that were otherwise identical, but when I added pit moss, those plants weren't having the nutrient deficiency symptoms like chlorosis of the leaves. And so it made me think about not just what's in each component, but how they work together and how one component can help make nutrients available that came from other components, but there's a synergy there. And so I was surprised that adding something that's made from paper could affect how nutrients are utilized so profoundly. That was surprising. And then another surprise that came up was that I didn't have any issues with growing peat-free in small containers. And I went to a nursery conference just earlier this month, and there was consensus among all the nursery practitioners, like, no, you can't grow peat-free in these tiny little plug containers. It just doesn't work. And I was very surprised because I was like, oh, wow, I've never had a problem with that. I didn't even know it was an issue. So it's really interesting to me how we can make these generalizations based on the materials that we've used specifically, but not realizing that there's a whole other array of options that may not come with those same issues.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really important point. Just, I think a lot of people base what they plan to do on word of mouth, what other growers have done, things that they hear from other people. And that is by no means a bad way of doing things. You find people that you trust that do things that are similar to you, and you rely on them and their expertise and their knowledge to help you. But sometimes those rules of thumb can kind of hinder our way forward. I mean, it could have influenced you. If you had heard that before, you would have been like, well, I'm not even going to bother with this, or I need to find something very specific to do this particular thing growing in those small cells. When really, if you just sort of went for it, I mean, like you did, you had no issues. And Dr. Bethke, I'm actually kind of curious. You have been working with substrates and messing around with them, like you said, since you were 8, playing with sawdust to grow plants. I'm curious what alternatives you have actually explored, and if you've seen anything that's like jumped out at you in terms of efficiency or other things that might be interesting for people to know.
Wow. I've seen a lot, done a lot, worked with everything from spun glass, rock wool to pure vermiculite, pure perlite, different kinds of bark, different kinds of compost, you name it. But one of the cautions working with things that are sustainable, with good stewardship, we try to use things. But each one of those things has a unique characteristic. Just like digging up peat in the second paradigm, we have to adapt that condition. And we learned through the work, like you said, of Boodley and Sheldrake at Cornell to adapt the sphagnum peat. And in fact, our whole industry is adapted now to working with the sphagnum peat based mixes. If you get a media analysis, the recommendations are based on sphagnum peat rather than the organic concept. Today, we use a few compost analyses and a few more analyses that give us a better view of what happens in the biome, the soil system. The soil system that we create with different substrates then requires different analysis and different interpretations. So I didn't answer your question exactly, but each component, even a bark from a softwood versus hardwood, aged bark versus a new bark, all have different impacts. And so you have to really think about, when you're being sustainable, There are many advantages you can realize, but yet you can destroy a good system by adding in a component that's not a good component. So you have to rely on careful research, like Julie was saying, and go at it. There are people that will try to tell you they have a product that's good for your soil. And I'm going to use biochar as an example. There's a lot of good biochar and bad biochar. I recently ran into a biochar that had extremely high boron. Some biochar has very high pH, some biochar, but it has value in certain situations. If you need boron, little biochar is good. If it's high potassium, it's good. So you have to consider how it fits into it. And I always say you have to look at three aspects. There's the physical structure, then there's the chemistry that it impacts, and then there's the biology. In each of those, there's not necessarily a higher priority to one or another, but you have to get the physical properties right. You have to get the chemistry in a good balance, pH, nutrients, etc. And then you want to make sure it's an environment where the biology can work. And if you have enough readily available carbon, the biology prospers better. And many of our substrates don't have readily available carbon. And a lot of the microbes thrive on that. So I'll just be quiet, or I can keep going.
You didn't answer my question directly, and I am glad, because you answered a much better one, which was about working with these alternatives and acknowledging the fact that things are not going to behave exactly the same as peat moss has, because they're not peat moss. So we should stop expecting a sort of completely seamless transition, and we should expect to do science and research and step-by-step work like you and Julie have done to see how we can integrate new materials, what the effect is on the specific things that we're managing, and go from there. So thank you for answering a much better question. And now, Ray, I want to ask you, as someone who's growing that wide variety of, annuals, perennials, foliage plants, that sort of thing, has your choice to use sustainable substrates had an effect on your consumers or your retailers or anything like that you've noticed?
So I think there's a huge opportunity for that. One of the real advantages we found this spring is that transplanting something that grown in pit moss into a landscape bed or a homeowner's beds seems to have less shock, and I relate that to the moisture retention of the pit moss, and we've been trying to promote that. We're in DC, or we're shipping in DC, so sustainability is a big word here, and people are certainly very interested in it. One of the other things that shocked me, because I've been in the grower business forever, is that we didn't use any fungicides this spring. When we transplanted, we went right into the pit moss and not do any preventative soil drenches like we normally would. And that was huge savings for us. It was a little bit, of adjustment for our growers to get used to how the plants grow in pit moss and how much moisture they can retain for a little bit longer than what they're used to. But we just work real close with Dr. Bethke and his team and our growers, and kind of figured it out. But I think there's a huge message for the retail consumer or your box grower, what this product can do, and the sustainability, and the success in gardening. We're all about how to be successful, and knocking out all the fungicides was a huge savings for us this year, as well as being able to reduce our fertilizer use.
Well, and I think you said something too in one of our previous discussions about how you think it would actually be influential for a customer, like a retail customer, to know what kind of impact they're having, beneficial impact they're having by buying a plant that's grown in a sustainable substrate.
Right. Right now we get a piece of paper that tells us bought a truckload of pit moss and how many cars we've taken off the road and how much carbon we've saved and all those things. And I think as a plant community, we could really put a scoreboard up on the pit moss website, or maybe it's on all of our websites, so that we can show as a whole, how much impact this product is having on sustainability in the environment.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. And that kind of gets at this idea too, that there are market reasons for wanting to explore alternatives, because as people become more aware of their environmental impact and they're pursuing better alternatives, or maybe not better, but more environmentally friendly alternatives, teaching them what, or showing them what their choice is having sort of upstream, like the impact that that's having, can compel them sometimes to pay a higher price for a certain item because it has this external effect. But also just showing them that our industry is sort of founded on this idea of good stewardship, doing better for the planet through beauty a lot of times, or growing food for people, or whatever, native plants, and restoring these ecosystems. So I think that's really interesting. And then Mark, I kind of wanted to ask you the same question. Has your choice to use sustainable substrates had an effect on your customers or retailers?
We do sell our seedlings to retail outlets, and we'll have our seedlings will be on plant racks, sometimes outside, sometimes under cover, for sometimes a number of weeks during the spring planting season. And our seedlings will be side by side with other growers that use conventional organic mixes. And I have heard from the folks that tend our plants that ours hold up better. They have they need less care, they need less watering. If it is a hot day, they hold up better in the in a variety of weather conditions, being tended by non-professional growers in retail spaces. So that's affirming that our mix is good for the plants and good for the customers. We hear from our farmers market customers, people that we have interaction with one-on-one, that our plants transplant very well and just take right off, and do very well in their gardens. So again, sort of circumstantial evidence, but a happy customer is going to keep me in business. And I love seeing people year after year come back and want to tell me about the successes that they've had in their garden.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool point, and kind of goes back to what, Julie was saying about experimenting with new things, because we have this status quo expectation for the way that peat-based mixes or other traditional mixes perform in terms of their water holding ability and that sort of thing. And just introducing new components, doing new things might bring you results. I think people tend to assume that a new product or a sustainable product might not have the same performance because it's got an advantage in this other way. So, well, it's kind of like for a long time, people are like, oh, well, it's gluten-free, so therefore it doesn't taste as good. When really there are some really nice gluten-free alternatives out there these days. And it's kind of the same thing, like, oh, it's sustainable, so I guess I'm sacrificing performance. And that's not always the case. Sometimes there are performance benefits to exploring alternative materials that may not be the big ticket item in the sales pamphlet for that product, but you might find that in different ways in your business, in efficiency, water, fertilizer, whatever, longer shelf life, that sort of thing. And Chris, I'm curious, like as a soil mixer and with your unique perspective, what sort of impact has your choice of sustainable substrate, has you branching out, had on your business?
Sorry, gotta unmute myself. Yeah, great question. So, as a regenerative farmer and someone who tries to, educate people on regenerative farming, one of the first conversations I have with people is about their native environments. What is your grow environment? What type of grow space are you working with? and what types of materials can you find around you. Because if we want to build something that's going to last a period of time, we want to try to gather some resources up the best we can, and we want to start with resources that are readily available to us. So I predominantly work with raised bed gardeners, and hugelculture style gardening has been something that we've really helped a lot of people take off with here around Michigan. And so in order to do so, you work with your native soil, you work with some compost, maybe you got some leaves, some grass clippings. We've even, had people use their animal wool fibers and put those down in there. And you build this layer system and you try to build this soil up the best you can. A lot of people are on a budget too, of course, and so you want to build massive gardens and hugelculture beds. I would love to bring them trailer after trailer after trailer of soil as much as they can afford, of course, but people don't have those type of budgets, and their gardening plans don't even really justify it, to spend thousands of dollars on soil to grow, a few $100s worth of crops or whatever it may be. So we want to build the soil up the best we can using, available resources to us, and try to minimize that expense to people. And so overall, people have had tremendous success of, building, what they can with the resources they can, in terms of their raised beds or hugelculture style of gardening. And then we come in and we have, the soil to put on the top of it. And, it's overall, the pit moss addition in there has helped, more cohesion within the soil. Because a big thing about hugelculture style gardening in these raised beds is you don't want soil loss and things like that. So you want, a dynamic soil that's going to hold place. And so, like I say, we've helped, a couple hundred different gardeners around the state of Michigan easily, develop these style of garden beds, and with great success over the last 4 or 5 years, and continues to grow. Every year people are like, oh, I'm building a new bed or I'm adding another one in, because people are seeing that, the more you can build these beds up, big roots produce big fruits. There's no doubt about that with all styles of gardening. If the roots are able to do what they want to do and continuously expand the way they want to grow, you're generally going to be growing very healthy plants. And so our customers have appreciated, the soil that we bring to them very much. They find that it absolutely helps bring their garden programs together, as well as, help finding different alternatives around them to help, build their soil up with minimal costs.
I think that's really interesting. And that's something I didn't mention in my presentation, but you don't necessarily just have to explore the different alternative materials. You can explore different methodologies. So I don't think a lot of gardeners know about like hugelkultur and like how those beds work. Or if they do, it's like sort of new and different to them and they need some explaining, but it's a really excellent methodology for them. And the same can be said for containerized growing. So Julie mentioned something about putting pit moss on the bottom of her pots. So using a more stratified media approach, that's becoming more popular. So there are lots of different ways to explore resilience or sustainability through methodology and materials. And I do want to get to a couple of these. We have a couple questions in our Q&A, and I'm just going to throw these out there to anybody who wants to answer. Cody says, I'm curious to hear the panelists' thoughts and experience using pit moss as a seed starting medium. Any difficulties or surprises?
Yeah, I can help there. No necessarily difficulties or surprises. Both of these questions here, I kind of just go back and forth because I know like pit moss makes like soils that are ready to go. I'm more using pit moss within my substrates and mixing something different. So I like to be at about like 30% of the pit moss. And then, I also want to make sure that I have a variety of NPK, CalMag type minerals in there. And those are what you're going to adjust for a starter mix versus, a later plant type of mix. You don't need quite as many nutrients in. So no real difficulties. I honestly find working pit moss is very similar to other substrates. The main thing that you got to think about is pH. You know, most peat is coming at like at about you know, 5, 6. It can be even as low as a 4 pH for, you know, sphagnum peat moss. Um, Pit moss is, you know, right around 6.5, 7, I believe, is what it generally comes in at. So I just have to be careful of adding too many things of high pH because you don't want to just keep jumping that pH up, 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 up. So you want to be cautious of that.
That's interesting. And then Ray, I saw you had unmuted yourself. Do you have something that you want to say about this?
So we use pit moss also for our unrooted cuttings. And then for seedlings, the only seedlings that we're really doing is our vegetable crops. We did not notice. It worked fine. It worked, you know, really well with our vegetable seedlings as well this year.
Well, we love to hear that. And then we have one more question. Does using paper-based substrate eliminate the need for supplemental fertilizer when growing in pots? As a native plant grower in Michigan, I also have nutrient issues, especially in plants that are in pots longer term. So Julie, I think you might be really good for this question. I think Julie might be frozen. If Julie does not reconnect, would anybody else like to contribute to that question?
I can let you know that the pit moss itself doesn't have much nutrient value in it. So if you get the blends that are prepared, you can get a full complement of nutrients, or you can make your own blends and put in your own sets of nutrients. Just like sphagnum is essentially sterile of nutrients, and you have to add that component in there as well. One of the things about these different materials, sustainable materials, pit moss comes in at a suitable pH, so you don't have to add lime. Therefore, you have to add the calcium and magnesium from another source. And of course, I'm offering, if anybody wants some answers to what they're doing, and I'd be glad to assist them in balancing the nutrient package.
Well, thank you, Dr. B. I think Julie is reconnecting here. So if she comes back in, I want her to answer that question. Julie, are you able to answer that second question from Joe in the chat?
Yeah, no problem. I think that it really depends with what your starting point is. So for me, I start with a pretty rich component of aged compost that has pretty substantial nutrients in it. And so when I add the paper-based substrate, I don't have to add additional fertilizer throughout my growing season. I have plants in pot sizes from D60Ls, which are pretty small tubes, all the way up to 27-gallon pots, clump plantings of willows. So pretty much all sizes and shapes of containers. And when I use paper-based substrate, it really helps retain the nutrients in a way so that I have not had to add supplemental fertilizer. And I do attribute that to starting off with enough fertilizer in the mix to begin with as well.
Well, thank you guys so much. We are right at 11 o'clock. So I unfortunately have to cut off this discussion here. It was a ton of fun. I hope you enjoyed yourselves. And I am personally hoping that you all will join us for a more technical discussion of pit moss itself at some point. But thank you so much for sharing with our viewers and also for the recorded audience what your experience has been like and why exploring sustainable substrates can be good for many, many different reasons. So thank you so much. You guys all have a wonderful day.